Lecture 1, The Voice in the Wilderness.
There's no doubt about it. The concerto has all the dramatic oomph, all the blood, sweat, tears, and triumph of the opera house. It's got the individual solo voice, or in the case of double concerti, triple concerti, or concerti grossi, multiple solo voices, ringing forth against the mass of the orchestra. A metaphor, my friends, for the empowered individual reveling in his or her individuality. The various relationships between soloist and orchestra embodied collectively in the concerto repertoire demonstrate pretty much every human relationship we can imagine, from the gentlest and tenderest to the most violent and confrontational, and everything in between. From the point of view of performance, a concerto represents musical life lived at the edge, as the solo instruments and the musicians who play them are often pushed to the very limit of what is possible, as composers seek constantly to explore the extremes of human experience through instrumental virtuosity. Because of the singularity of the soloist's voice, the range and immediacy of expression inherent in the concerto exceeds that of every other type of music excepting opera, which, as we will discuss, gave birth to the concerto during the late 17th century. Where the symphony, another genre birthed by opera, evolved towards abstraction and high seriousness, the concerto has never lost its essentially theatrical roots. In a concerto, the soloist's voice becomes our voice. The soloist's battles and victories become our battles and victories. For all its symphonic bulk, a concerto is a much more intimate, a much more personalized sort of musical experience than a symphony. And talk about a huge repertoire. The concerto was invented long before the symphony. As a result, Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, Corelli, and Telemann wrote scads of concerti, but among them, not a single symphony. Of the first-rank composers who wrote both concerti and symphonies, Mozart's great concerti far outnumber his great symphonies. Beethoven's concerti nearly outnumber his symphonies, counting the Piano Fantasy, Opus 80, 8 concerti by Beethoven against 9 symphonies. Brahms composed 4 concerti and 4 symphonies. We could go on, but you get the point. During the 18th and 19th centuries, at least as many concerti were composed as symphonies. And during the 20th century, well, forget about it. In terms of sheer number, the concerto was, by far, the single most important genre of orchestral music. So we've lots of repertoire to deal with and choose from, perhaps even too much. For this, I trust, we will be forgiven our omissions. As always, the essential goal of this sort of survey is not to cover exhaustively the entire repertoire. For that, my friends, the good Lord created textbooks, but rather to create a historical and musical context for the concerto. Relationships. Yes, relationships. The genre of concerto, like our own lives, is based on relationships. The relationship between the soloist or soloists and the orchestra becomes a metaphor for the relationship between the individual and society, the one and the many, the singular and the collective. At its heart, the concerto is a theatrical construct. You see, the concerto is as much about the relationships between the performers themselves, the actual people on stage, as it is about the music they play. This is a key concept, and it's a concept that will drive much of this course. So let's make sure we've got it. My friends, a symphony is a musical construct. A symphony is about its themes and how those themes are contrasted, varied, transformed, developed, and so forth. Certainly, a symphony can be filled with metaphor, expressive meaning, even programmatic content. But even in a programmed symphony, like, for example, Beethoven's Symphony No. 6, the Pastoral, even in a programmed symphony, the programmatic meaning is projected musically through the character of the themes themselves as played by the orchestra. A concerto adds an extra dimension, a dimension that changes everything. A soloist, or a group of soloists, I would suggest that when we see a soloist walk across the stage and take her place before the orchestra, we don't just see a violinist or a pianist or a cellist. We also perceive her as one of us, as an individual, someone apart from the mass of the orchestra. We look at her face, her clothes, her body language. We see a person, not just an instrument. Like an actor striding onto the stage, she carries with her our hopes and aspirations. Her song becomes our song. And unlike the conductor, who enters and then turns his back to us, we get to watch the soloist full on, or at least in profile, through the entire performance. And thus, the essential theatricality of the concerto. The genre is as much about the individual, the soloist, versus the collective, the orchestra, as it is about the music they actually play. In a way different from any other sort of instrumental music, concerti are exciting. All right, our goals. The essential goals of this course are 3 in number. 1, we're going to survey the history of the concerto from its invention in Italy in the late 1600s through the 20th century. Our second goal will be to explore the evolving nature of the concerto as a genre and the degree to which that evolution is a reflection of a changing social and artistic environment. Goal number 3 will be to observe the evolving theatricality of the concerto and the degree to which this theatricality is a metaphor for the individual and the collective. As the English musicologist Sir Donald Francis Tovey so beautifully put it, and we quote, "Nothing in human life or history is more thrilling or of more ancient and universal experience than the antithesis of the individual and the crowd." An antithesis which is familiar in the concerto repertoire in every degree, from flat opposition to harmonious reconciliation, unquote. Over the course of this survey, we are going to hear a simply stunning variety of concerti, works spanning nearly 3 centuries, from Alessandro Stradella's concerto-styled sonata in D major for trumpet and strings of circa 1680 to Donald Erb's trombone concerto of 1976. Please, the briefest of brief teasers. Let us taste from the cup of concerto. We'll examine the full range of this repertoire, from the groundbreaking concerti of Il Rosso Prieto, the Red Priest, Antonio Vivaldi, from the gorgeous, elegant, and unerringly tasteful concerti of Mozart, in which soloist and orchestra are conceived as virtual equals, to the outlandishly excessive, soloist as hero, over-the-top romantic era virtuoso vehicles that are the concerti of Franz Liszt. From the thrilling, energized Eastern European folk music-inspired concerti of Bela Bartok, to the complex and entirely brilliant simultaneity of musics that is Elliott Carter's double concerto for harpsichord and piano of 1961. That, my friends, will put some rum in your Ovaltine. Yes? Onwards. Words, meanings, and some deep background. The word concerto comes from the Italian verb concertare, which means to join together and to be in agreement with, just as in English we might say two things are in concert with one another, or to work together in concert. The earliest surviving music publication to use the word concerto was printed in Venice in 1587, a series of compositions by Andrea and Giovanni Gabrieli entitled Concerti per voci e strumenti musicali, meaning concerti for voices and musical instruments. Clearly, in its earliest musical usage, the word concerto was used very generally to refer to, 1, any ensemble of mixed instruments and or voices, and 2, a performance by such an ensemble. In English, such an ensemble would be called a consort, and a performance would be called a concert. Okay. The past participle of the word concerto is concertato, and this word developed a rather different musical meaning. Concertato came to be understood as meaning to fight, or contend, or contest with, as in various groups of instruments within an ensemble, fighting, or contending, or contesting with each other. A style of music came into being in Italy during the late 1500s and early 1600s called the stile concertato, or the concertato style. The growing secularization and humanization of the late 16th and 17th centuries impacted hugely on the music of the time. The smooth, homogeneous musical texture of the early 16th century, the 1500s, was, by the late 16th century, being increasingly replaced by bold contrasts of sound, as composers sought to create ever more magnificent, ever more viscerally powerful music. Music meant not to stimulate divine thought, but rather meant to excite the listener's passions, meaning heightened, idealized, and extreme emotions. The first great flowering of the concertato principle, the concertato style, the concerto principle, was centered in St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice during the late 1500s. The design of St. Mark's, with its two widely spaced organ lofts, encouraged composers to experiment by placing different instrumental and vocal choirs in different locations of the cathedral. The so-called polychoral, or many-chorus music that was the result, is all about bold effect. And while this music is about as subtle as a woolly mammoth in your boudoir, it is indeed striking and dramatic and moves our passions very nicely. As an example of this polychoral music and the concertato style it represents, let's hear a bit of Giovanni Gabrieli's Buccinate in Neominia Tuba, Blow the Trumpet in the New Moon. The piece is scored for 4 different choirs that together number 19 different instrumental and voice parts. While we listen, let's be aware of the following. 1. This is flamboyant, magnificent music. It might be religious music, but it's music calculated to inspire its listeners to spiritual ecstasy as opposed to prayerful contemplation. 2. Let's be aware of the bold contrast between instrumental and vocal sonorities as the various choirs alternate with each other and play together in various combinations. 3, let's remember that this music was meant to be listened to in St. Mark's and that no recording can even approach the effect of a live performance. Giovanni Gabrieli's Buccinate in Neominia Tuba, the concertato style in action. The inspiration behind Buccinate in Neominia Tuba and other like polychoral works was a time-honored singing technique called antiphony. Antiphony means literally sound against sound. An antiphonal texture is one in which the sections of a chorus, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, alternate with one another. What the Venetian composers of polychoral music did was extrapolate outwards. Instead of having sections within a chorus alternate with each other, entire choruses of both voices and instruments alternate with one another. All of this inspired by and made possible by the unique architecture of St. Mark's Cathedral. Giovanni Gabrieli lived from circa 1555 to 1612, and Buccinati was probably composed right around the year 1600. This and other like works by Gabrieli and his contemporaries are the ancestors of the concerto. They are the first works to explore what became the concerto principle, the systematic exploitation of contrast through both the opposition and cooperation of different groups of performers. Opera. The same Renaissance-inspired humanistic expressive impulse that led to the creation of the polychoral works of Gabrieli also brought about the invention of opera in Florence during the last years of the 16th century. Without a doubt, the composers, the poets, actors, singers, and aestheticians who invented opera believed to the very depth of their cockles that they were recreating in modern guise the dramatic art of the ancient Greeks, an art in which stage plays were sung, or at least chanted, with the music intensifying the meaning of the words and the feelings behind the words a gazillionfold. An opera is a stage play set to music, and the earliest surviving opera is Jacopo Peri's Eurydice, which was first performed at Florence's Pitti Palace in October of 1600. A convenient date, because with the invention of opera, the nature and expressive content of Western music changed forever. In music, we date the Baroque era as beginning there in Firenze on October 6th, 1600, an era about, more than anything else, the passions or the affections, about expressing and controlling the most powerful of emotions. Oh, opera, how do we love thee? Let us count the ways. Opera recognized and celebrated the primacy of individual emotion to a degree far beyond any musical genre that had existed to its time. Opera recognized that only solo singing, one person at a time, could portray individual emotion and inspire an audience to empathize with that emotion. An entirely new musical vocabulary had to evolve to accommodate the expressive needs of the operatic stage. The concept of tune evolved, a specialized sort of melody in which the actual melodic substance could evoke moods and feelings by itself, independent of the words being sung. An entirely new sort of harmonic accompaniment was invented to accompany singers, a technique that came to be known as the basso continuo, which went on to become ubiquitous in both the vocal and instrumental music of the Baroque. Opera required that larger and larger instrumental ensembles be employed, not just to accompany the singers, but also to create a sonic environment appropriate to the locations and actions being projected on stage. Instruments, like the oboe and the horn, had to be modernized for use in this growing ensemble, and thus was the orchestra born. Oh, my friends, even the word orchestra came from the opera theater. Orchestra is the Greek word for the area immediately beneath the stage where the instrumental ensemble sat and from where they performed. Thus, a location, the orchestra, gave its name to the ensemble that actually performed there. Two more opera-inspired points that contributed directly to the invention of the concerto. First, the dramatic situations of opera forced composers to experiment ever more with musical materials that could, on their own, create states of light and dark, joy and despair, and everything in between. It's one of those ironies that in doing so, opera laid the foundation for the evolution of a strictly instrumental musical tradition by expanding hugely the melodic and harmonic vocabulary available to composers. Second, opera created the concept of the musical primo uomo and prima donna, the first man and the first woman. And here we're not talking about Adam and Eve, but rather the stars of the show, the individuals whose music intensified trials, tribulations, successes and failures become their audience's own. Now at first, opera was a courtly entertainment for those Italian nobles who had the ducats to commission them, usually for important occasions like weddings, ordinations, bat mitzvahs, and the like. But everything changed in 1637 when two singers and opera composers, Francesco Manelli and Benedetto Ferrari, opened the first public opera house in Venice, which they called San Cassiano. My friends, it was one of the great innovations of all time, the greatest invention before sliced bread. San Cassiano made opera available to anyone for the price of a ticket, and the popularity of opera exploded across the Western world. The violin. There's just one more historical development we must discuss before we can explore the first concerti, and that is the invention of the violin. The violin family of instruments, the violin, the viola, and cello, began to emerge from workshops in the northern Italian cities of Cremona and Brescia between 1520 and 1530. With its four strings, curved back, and elevated bridge, the violin had an infinitely bigger and richer tone and was capable of a much greater range of nuance and power than the viol family of stringed instruments that preceded it. Over the next 200 years, the violin family was brought to a level of perfection sometimes equaled but never surpassed, in particular by a series of master luthiers working out of the city of Cremona. Luthiers who included Niccolo Amati, Andrea Guarneri, Francesco Ruggeri, and Antonio Stradivari. The star of the violin family was, and still is, the violin itself, the soprano voice of the family, its prima donna. The rise of the violin as the principal instrument in Western music corresponded exactly with the rise of opera, and the voice of the violin became, in the growing canon of Baroque instrumental music, the instrumental analog to the voice of the soprano on the opera stage. Even though the first concerti we will examine are not violin concerti per se, we must understand that, one, the 17th century cult of the violin preconditioned composers to think operatically in their instrumental music, and, two, just as later composers tended to be keyboard players by training, so the great Italian Baroque composers of concerti were violinists by training. Alessandro Stradella, 1644 to 1682. By the late 1660s, a critical mass had been achieved with the emergence of the concept of thematic melody, of tune, with the advances in the tonal harmonic system and instrumental design and manufacture we discussed, with the emergence of the operatic ideal of dramatic ebb and flow. It became possible for composers to create large-scale, multi-section instrumental compositions in which the elements of melody, harmony, texture, and form were of sufficient substance and interest to provide a meaningful and understandable musical experience without the need of words to explain musical events. While we would never say that any one person invented the concerto, we can say that the first composer to compose works that we today accept as concerti was Alessandro Stradella, who lived from 1644 to 1682. Stradella was one of the most important composers of opera and oratorios of his generation. He was also a bit of a ladies' man, my friends, and a rather shady character, even more so than your average composer. In 1667, at the age of 24, he teamed up with an abbot named Antonio Sforza and a violinist named Carlo Lonati and embezzled a rather large sum of money from the Catholic Church. The theft was discovered, and Stradella, one step ahead of the law, exited Rome post-haste. He ended up in Venice, where he was hired by a wealthy and powerful Venetian businessman named Alvise Contarini to teach music to his mistress. It was a bad hire. After a few lessons, Stradella left Venice with Contarini's mistress in tow. Now, Don Contarini did not take this well, and he sent a hit squad after the couple, and Stradella hopped across Italy, keeping a step or two ahead of the Assassini. After a series of entanglements with various other married aristocratic ladies, he finally met his end. Hired to teach music to a daughter of Genoa's powerful Lomellini family, he apparently tutored her in more than just musical technique. Lomellini's bravi bumped Stradella off on Genoa's Piazza Bianchi on February 25th, 1682. He was but 37 years old. Stradella's larger instrumental compositions are concerti grossi, the plural of concerto grosso. In these works, Stradella contrasts two ensembles in the concertato style, a small group of solo instruments and a full string section. The small group of soloists in Stradella's concerti, usually two violins, is called the concertino, meaning literally the little ensemble. The larger group, the body of the string orchestra, is called the grosso, meaning the large ensemble, or the ripieno, meaning the full ensemble. Stradella cut his musical teeth composing operas. It was as an opera composer that he developed a style of vocal accompaniment that alternated a small group of strings with the full ensemble. This sort of composing found its way directly into the purely instrumental work we're going to sample, the Sonata in D major for trumpet and strings, dating from around 1680. Please, don't let its title fool you. This piece is indeed a concerto grosso, with an extra feature thrown in, a solo trumpet that mediates between the two string ensembles, the concertino and the grosso. My friends, the operatic impulse behind this music could not be more explicit. This is exactly what Stradella did in the opera house. That is, accompany a solo singer, here the trumpet, with a concerto grosso-like accompaniment. What have we got? A compositional technique forged in the opera house, transferred to instrumental music. Let's hear the first of the sonata's 4 movements, and let's be aware that this is one of the oldest self-standing orchestral works in existence. Again, what makes this a concerto is not just the solo trumpet wafting above the orchestra like an operatic soprano, but the actual nature of the orchestral accompaniment beneath the trumpet. Stradella divides his string orchestra into 2 ensembles, a small one, the concertino, and a larger one, the grosso or ripieno. These 2 ensembles contest, contrast, and contend with one another, and thus we say that this writing is an example of the concertato style, and therefore an embodiment of the concerto principle, a principle of contrasting ensembles within the orchestra. Arcangelo Corelli, 1653 to 1713. In 1689, the Italian composer Angelo Berardi noted that, and we quote, "The concertos for violins and other instruments of the celebrated violinist Arcangelo Corelli, who is the new Orpheus of our time, are especially esteemed today," unquote. Corelli was born in Fusignano, not far from Bologna. Bologna was an important musical center, and it's a testament to Corelli's fame in his own lifetime that he was known across Europe simply as Il Bolognese, the Bolognian. Corelli moved to Rome sometime in the early 1670s, where he made a living as a violinist. In 1675, he was in the violin section for the premiere of Alessandro Stradella's oratorio, St. John the Baptist, an oratorio in which Stradella divided the orchestra and arrayed it in concertato style. In 1689, Corelli, who was, at 36, one of the most famous violinists in Europe and a composer of growing repute, had the great good fortune to be appointed first violinist and music director to the newly elevated Cardinal Pietro Ottoboni. Cardinal Ottoboni, all of 22 years old at the time he was elevated by his uncle, Pope Alexander VIII, yes, flagrant nepotism, was, despite his youth, a great patron of music and became for Corelli a true padrone. Corelli moved into the Cardinal's palace in Rome, where he was coddled, pampered, and assured of financial security, and given the time to revise and polish his work at a time when most composers had to turn out new music really by the hour. Corelli's music was published in 6 batches. The first 4 batches, opuses 1 through 4, each consists of 12 trio sonatas, 48 in all. Opus 5 consists of 5 solo sonatas, and Opus 6, the final batch, consists of 12 concerti grossi. Now, obviously, this relatively modest list of works doesn't account for all of Corelli's music, but it does indicate that Corelli lavished an extraordinary degree of care and consideration on those works he did publish, and in doing so, he created a body of printed music that was performed, studied, and imitated for the next 50 years and more. Corelli's published works consisted entirely of instrumental music. Corelli was, according to the musicologist Donald Grout, and we quote, exceptional among Italian composers in that he apparently wrote no vocal music whatsoever. Oh, this, my friends, is like saying that someone worked in a chocolate factory for 60 years and never had a piece of chocolate. Instead, back to our quote, Corelli transferred the Italian genius for song to the violin, the instrument that most nearly approached the lyric expressive quality of the human voice, unquote. Corelli's 12 concerti grossi, opus 6, were published by the house of Etienne Roger in Amsterdam in 1714, a year after his death. The majority of them were, in all likelihood, composed 32 years before, in and around 1682, which would make them among the earliest concerti composed. But more than just being among the first concerti, Corelli's are the foundation of the entire genre as it grew and evolved. They set the standards for the next 50 years' worth of concerti by their marvelous use of the concerto principle, the concertato style. General observations. Corelli's concerti are scored for string orchestra and basso continuo. Each concerto employs a concertino consisting of 2 violins and a cello. In general, there is little thematic difference between the solo sections, that is, the music played by the concertino, and those scored for the full ensemble. The contrast, then, is not so much thematic as it is instrumental, the concertino versus the grosso, or ripieno. As an example, let's turn to what is the most famous of all Corelli's concerti, Opus 6, number 8 in G minor, the so-called Christmas Concerto. Oh, the published score bears the inscription, Fatto per la notte di Natale, which translates as written for Christmas Eve. Cardinal Ottoboni's account books indicate that Corelli was indeed paid to compose a concerto for the Christmas of 1690, which in all likelihood refers to this concerto. The concerto is cast in 6 movements, and at 14 minutes in total length, it is the longest of the Opus 6 concerti grossi. Movement 1 begins with a powerful introductory phrase played by both the concertino and the grosso, an orchestral tutti, meaning everyone. Following this introductory phrase, the instruments of the concertino enter one at a time, first the cello, and then the 2 violins. Finally, the rest of the ensemble, the grosso, enters, and the remainder of the movement consists of a constant back and forth between the concertino and the grosso. Let's hear this opening movement. The second movement, marked allegro, meaning fast, puts the 2 violins and cello of the concertino in the forefront, accompanied by the grosso. The slow third movement opening sees each new phrase initiated by the concertino and concluded by the tutti, meaning everybody, concertino and grosso. The fourth movement, labeled vivace, meaning lively, is a dance-like movement that sees the concertino and tutti alternate phrase by phrase. We hear this movement in its entirety. The brilliant fifth movement offers the most in-our-faces concertato-style writing in the entire concerto, as the concertino and the grosso, like a tug-of-war, contest every phrase. The sixth and final movement is the single longest movement in any of Corelli's published concerti. It's marked as being a pastorale, and it's the movement that puts the Christmas in the Christmas oratorio. We are told that the quiet, flowing, lyric pastorale came to be associated particularly with Christmas time in 17th century Italy. The Christmas pastorale was intended to recall the biblical shepherds who attended the birth of Jesus, and is closely related to the tradition of rural Italian shepherds who came to towns on Christmas morning to serenade images of Christ, in imitation of the biblical shepherds. The rustic, out-of-doors character of Corelli's pastorale is a function of its simple, direct, almost folk-like melody and the bagpipe-like drone in the accompaniment. The movement alternates between concertino and tutti, and the sense of contest heard in the previous movement is here replaced by one of absolute collaboration. Let's hear the first half of this sixth and final movement. My friends, I cannot recommend Corelli's Concerti Grossi too highly. They represent the Italian mid-Baroque at its very best. And while they might not demonstrate the sort of instrumental virtuosity that will soon enough become the essence of the concerto, their lyricism, balance, craft, elegance, and clarity make them simply the best, most important, and most influential set of orchestral works composed in the 17th century. Thank you.